DNA test can't. It
cannot.
cannot.
Identify whether you have certain genetic traits that might be from North America, like Canada, or might be from South America as well, right?
Right.
In a freezer in Copenhagen, there is a vial of dirt that rewrote the story of how humans reached the Americas. No bones, no skeleton, just mud, and the genetic code locked inside it. When researchers read that code, they found that the ancestors of every Native American broke away from their East Asian relatives around 36,000 years ago. Not 13,000, not 15,000. 36,000, which leaves a problem nobody in archaeology wanted to touch. If the split was that early, where were these people for the next 20,000 years? For almost 100 years, the answer to when people arrived in the Americas was carved in stone. The first humans walked in around 13,000 years ago. They came out of Siberia, crossed a land bridge into Alaska when the seas were low, slipped through a gap in the ice, and spread south across 2 empty continents. We even gave them a name. The Clovis people, after a town in New Mexico where their famous spear points first turned up in the 1930s. That was the story. Clovis first, nobody before them. And for decades, that sentence worked less like a theory and more like a law. If you were an archaeologist and you found something older, you had 2 choices. Prove it beyond any shadow of a doubt, or watch your name quietly disappear. Any site claiming an earlier date got picked apart, explained away, filed under bad samples, bad dating, or wishful thinking. The pushback was so fierce that researchers started using a nickname for the defenders of the old timeline. They called them the Clovis Police, and the police were good at their job. For 2 generations, almost nothing got past them. The first real crack in the wall did not come from a lab, it came from a soggy dig in southern Chile called Monte Verde. Starting in the 1970s, an archaeologist named Tom Dillahay began pulling the remains of an ancient village out of a peat bog there. Wooden tent stakes, old fire pits, chewed healing leaves. Even a single child's footprint pressed into clay and frozen in time, and the dates came back at more than 14,000 years old, over 1,000 years before Clovis. For 2 decades, the find was torn apart. It could not be right, the thinking went, because it was not allowed to be right. Finally, in 1997, a group of the most respected names in American archaeology flew down to Chile expecting to tear the site apart in person. Instead, they walked away convinced. Monte Verde was real. The wall had a hole in it, and once there was one hole, people quietly started looking for others. Then the gene scientists showed up, and they were not playing by archaeology's rules at all. Gene science does not care about spear points. It reads the body itself, the long chemical record every living thing carries, copied and passed down with tiny mistakes that pile up over time like rings stacking inside a tree. Count the differences between 2 groups of people, and you can work out how long ago they were a single people. There is no arguing with a spear point about its age. There is no arguing with a genome either, but for a very different reason. The genome does not have an opinion, it just tells you what happened. In 2018, a team led by Eske Willerslev at the University of Copenhagen read the full genome of a baby girl who had been buried at a place called Upward Sun River, deep in the cold inland of Alaska, more than 11,000 years ago. The local native community gave her a name, Sunrise Girl Child. Her DNA did something nobody had planned for. It did not match the northern branch of Native Americans. It did not match the southern branch either. She belonged to a third group entirely, a group of people that had broken off and gone its own way, a whole bloodline that no one knew had ever existed until her tiny bones gave it up. Scientists called them the ancient Beringians. They are gone now. No one alive today comes from them, but they were the key that unlocked the timeline. When the team ran the numbers backward, the dates stretched far past anything the textbooks allowed. The founding group of Native Americans had begun pulling away from their East Asian ancestors around 36,000 years ago, with the 2 groups still mixing and trading genes until roughly 25,000 years ago. There was a second piece too. Somewhere between 25,000 and 20,000 years ago, those ancestors picked up DNA from another ancient group. A people known from a single boy buried near Lake Baikal in Siberia about 24,000 years ago. That boy's genome shows up, just barely, in every Native American alive today. I mean, think about that for a second. By the time the first Clovis spear point was ever chipped into shape, this split was already older than the painted caves at Lascaux. The people the textbooks called the first Americans were, in their genes, already ancient history before they ever existed. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. because a split date is not an arrival date. The two groups parting ways 36,000 years ago does not mean anyone walked into Alaska 36,000 years ago. It means that somewhere, for a very long stretch of time, a band of humans sat cut off from everyone they had left behind, slowly drifting apart and becoming something new. The question was, where? And the answer is one of the strangest chapters in the entire human story. The land bridge between Siberia and Alaska was not really a bridge, it was a continent. A huge, cold, treeless grassland that scientists call Beringia, uncovered when the Ice Age locked away so much of the world's water that the oceans dropped by hundreds of feet. The leading idea, built almost entirely on gene science, is that people did not simply pass over Beringia on their way south. They stopped. They lived there, sealed off, for thousands of years, while the great ice sheets blocked the road into the rest of the Americas. This is the Beringian standstill. A waiting room the size of a country. A small group of humans sitting out the worst of the Ice Age on a frozen plain, hunting mammoth and bison across a grassland that no longer exists, and quietly turning, generation by generation, into the ancestors of everyone from Alaska to the tip of Chile. They were not lost. They were not wandering. They were stuck by ice they could not cross, for longer than all of written history has lasted since. Some researchers saw this coming long before the genomes proved it. Back in the 1990s, the very first studies of Native American mitochondrial DNA, the genetic line handed down from mother to child, were already spitting out numbers like 30,000, 35,000, even 40,000 years. The scientists who got those results were told flatly that they were wrong. The dates were too deep, too uncomfortable. There was no way to fit them against a continent everyone agreed had been empty. So the whole field set the numbers aside and moved on. The sign was sitting there the entire time. Nobody wanted to read it. Then an archaeologist named Laurien Bourgeon came forward with the bones. Back in the 1970s and 80s, a Canadian researcher named Jacques Cinq-Mars had dug into a set of caves in the Yukon called Bluefish Caves, sitting deep inside what had once been Beringia. He pulled out animal bones that looked butchered, cut by stone tools, and he dated some of them back as far as 24,000 years. For that, he was treated like a crank. His funding dried up. His career stalled. Other scientists doubted him to his face, and he spent years watching the whole field stroll past his work as if it were a joke. He passed away in 2021. But before that, Bourgeon went back to his collection and looked at it again, bone by bone. Out of 36,000 fragments, she found at least 15 marked with the deep, thin, V-shaped cuts that only a human blade leaves behind. The oldest, a horse jaw with long, straight slices on the inside where the muscle had been stripped away, came back at 23,500 years old. Cinq-Mars had been right the entire time. Proven right, decades too late, by the same bones he had been mocked for digging up. And Bluefish sits in exactly the right place to be the standstill made real, people living in Beringia at the peak of the Ice Age, waiting for the road south to open. That was the story the genetics told in private. Behind the scenes, the ground itself was about to back it up, and the ground does not care about anyone's name. In the White Sand Flats of White Sands, New Mexico, there is a stretch of pale, ancient mud that was once the shoreline of a shallow lake. In 2019, researchers found footprints pressed into it, human footprints. Children and teenagers mostly, walking along the wet edge of the water. In some places, their tracks run beside the prints of giant ground sloths and mammoths, animals that have been gone for over 10,000 years. When the dates came back, they exploded. The prints were laid down between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. That is not just before Clovis. That is the very middle of the last glacial maximum, the coldest and harshest peak of the entire Ice Age, the exact moment when the way south was supposed to be slammed shut behind walls of ice a mile thick. Naturally, the dates were challenged. Some scientists pointed out that the first ages came from the seeds of a water plant, and water plants can soak up old carbon straight from the lake water, which can make them read far older than they actually are. A fair point, an honest one. And if those seeds had been the only evidence, the footprints might have been quietly drowned under the doubt and forgotten. But the team went back. They dated pollen, then they dated the ancient lake mud itself. A completely different material running on a completely different clock. 3 different methods. The same answer, every single time. By the time they were finished, there were 55 separate carbon dates, all of them pointing at the same narrow window in deep time. You would think that would settle it. One of the lead scientists put it about as plainly as a scientist ever does. He said it would take a miracle of bad luck for every one of those dates to be wrong in exactly the same direction. Nobody had said something for decades because the answer was unthinkable. Now the answer was just sitting there in the dirt, refusing to go away. But the version of this story you have probably heard, the one where it all comes down to a few disputed footprints, is not the full picture, because White Sands was not alone. Roughly 1,000 miles to the south, high in the Astillero Mountains of northern Mexico, there is a cave called Chiquihuite. It sits at 2,740 meters above sea level, nearly 9,000 feet up, reached by a punishing climb through country now ruled by criminal gangs. An archaeologist named Cyprian Ardelian spent years walking that mountain range on foot, reading the shape of the land before he ever found it. And once his team started digging into the cave floor, they pulled out close to 2,000 stone objects, knives, scrapers, blades, points, shaped from a greenish, glassy kind of limestone that is not found inside the cave, which means somebody had to carry the rock up that mountain. When the team published their work in the journal Nature in 2020, the dates were almost too much to take in. The deepest layers ran from 25,000 to 33,000 years old. Pay attention to this next part, because it is the part that makes the site so hard to wave away. The artifacts were not a single lucky pile in one layer. They were scattered through the cave floor across thousands of years of on and off use, the oldest of them pushing past 30,000 years. Now, Chiquihuite is really argued over, and there is no point pretending otherwise. A separate group of scientists studied the very same stones and said they were not tools at all. Their case was that in a cave sitting under a crumbling cliff, falling rocks smash into one another and chip in ways that can fake the look of human work. Geofacts, they called them, not artifacts. Ardelian's team fired straight back, insisting that anyone who actually looked could see the on-purpose shaping, the repeated method, a whole tool-making style that matched nothing else on the continent. That argument is still burning today. But notice what nobody argues about. Nobody is fighting about the age of the layers. The dating holds. The only question left is who, or what, put those stones in the dark of that cave. There is one more twist worth naming. Willerslev's lab, the same group from Copenhagen, searched the cave dirt for ancient DNA and pulled out tiny bits of DNA from plants and Ice Age animals. What they did not find was a single scrap of human DNA. The people, if they were people, left their tools and left no trace of their own bodies behind. A signature with the name torn off. For a while, it might have looked like these were just two strange one-offs, the kind of thing you can shrug off one at a time. That did not last. Because once you line the gene science up next to the footprints in the cave, they stop looking like they clash. They start reading like the same story, told 3 different ways. Go back to the problem we opened with. The DNA says the ancestors of Native Americans broke from East Asians around 36,000 years ago. The footprints say humans were standing in New Mexico by 23,000 years ago. The cave hints at people in Mexico, possibly earlier still. And the standstill model hands all of it a place to live. People could have been spread across Beringia and trickling into the Americas in small numbers, long before the big, clear journey that gene science tracks best. Not one brave crossing by one band of first travelers. A slow, leaky, messy seep of human beings into an empty half of the world, beginning tens of thousands of years before anyone said they were allowed to be there. And there was a way in, even with the ice locked in place. The old picture had everyone squeezing through a narrow, ice-free gap down the middle of Canada, a path that was sealed solid during the worst of the Ice Age and only cracked open far too late to explain the oldest sites. But that gap was never the only door. Along the Pacific edge of the continent, the coastline stayed open in patches, lined with pockets of life. Kelp forests, fish, seals, shellfish clinging to the rocks, seabirds nesting by the thousands. Scientists even have a name for it, the Kelp Highway, a green ribbon of food running unbroken down the western shore. A boat and a coastline, that is all it would have taken. People could have paddled and walked down the western edge of 2 continents while the entire inside was still frozen, moving generation by generation toward the equator, and they could have done it leaving almost nothing behind. Because the beaches they traveled are now sitting under hundreds of feet of risen sea, the evidence is not missing. It is underwater, scattered across a drowned coastline we have barely begun to search. And this is the part that keeps the scientists awake at night. Those footprints at White Sands are old enough to cause a deeper problem than just making the Clovis police look foolish. They may be older than the genetic split that led to living Native Americans in the first place, which leaves 2 possible answers, and neither one is comfortable. Either there was an even earlier group of people in the Americas, people who arrived, lived, walked across that lake bed at White Sands, and then disappeared completely, leaving no one alive today who came from them. A lost first wave, wiped out so completely that all that is left of them is footprints in hardened mud. Or something is still wrong with how we are reading the evidence, and the most carefully dated tracks in the Americas are somehow lying to us. The scientists who found the prints leaned toward the first answer. There were people here. They were real. They left their steps in the mud beside the mammoths. And then, somewhere in the long dark of the Ice Age, their line simply ran out, swallowed so completely that they show up in no one's genes alive today. Ghosts with feet. For almost a century, the entire argument came down to one number. When did people get here? 13,000 years, 16,000, 23,000, 30,000. The number keeps sliding backward, and it will probably keep sliding, because every few years the ground coughs up something older than the last thing that broke the record. But the number was never the real question. The real question is the one the footprints ask and then refuse to answer. Who were they? A child walking the edge of a vanished lake while mammoths moved along the far shore. People shivering in a cave 9,000 feet up a mountain, chipping stone tools in total darkness at the height of an ice age. Where did they come from? How did they get so far, so early, across a world of ice? And what happened to the ones who left no children to remember them? The dirt in that freezer in Copenhagen answered a question we had been asking for 100 years. It answered it by handing us a far bigger one. The first Americans were here longer, and arrived earlier than almost anyone dared to believe. And we are only now starting to understand that we barely know them at all.